Welcome back. Now that we've left 716 Columbus Avenue and you've seen the Grand Cigar Factory and we have taken a tour of the building, now we're getting back to 1919 when they're leaving Boston. Wait and Bond is leaving Boston. They've made the decision, but a lot of people speculate that they were forced out. And in some ways, yes, they were forced out, or they were put in a position where they had to make a decision. And for the sake of the bottom line, it just made more sense to leave Boston and set up shop in New Jersey. But behind the scenes, it's all playing out according to the plan. And the plan is, of course, to push the machine-made cigar to transition to machine-made cigar factories and to begin to introduce to the public the benefits of a machine-made cigar. So even though one can argue that the unions placed Wait and Bond in an uncomfortable position, in a position which further hastened their exit from Boston and further hastened their desire to incorporate machine-made cigars into the industry standard. So basically, it just sped things up. And there's a lot to be said about the way that the unions approached the 1919 cigar strike and the way that they particularly treated Wait and Bond. And primarily it was because Wait and Bond was the biggest fish in the pond. They were the biggest fish in the river, actually, or the ocean at one point. But they were susceptible to the attacks of the union workers, and they had been for quite some time. I said, look, strikes have been a part, as long as there was a dominant union for the cigar industry, the cigar makers united, there were strikes. And even before that union, there were strikes. When we're talking about going further back, 1877, there was a major strike. 1901, there was a major strike in Tampa, primarily. 1910, once again in Tampa. 1912, it was Detroit. Then 1919, of course, was the big one in Boston and New York City. And you had strikes throughout the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and on. And it was just one of those things. Rarely did the workers come out on top. But yes, working conditions were already improving. Part of the pushback from the worker to the employer in regards to the conditions of the factories that they were working in was that, in response, of course, the big cigar makers that were transitioning to machine-made cigars would turn around and say, well, look, due to the fact that we've transitioned to machine-made cigars, we've now got a cleaner and more sanitary working environment. This is beneficial. It's beneficial to the worker. It is in their favor. And it was a missed opportunity by the labor unions to capitalize and actually become a part of the machine-made cigar industry. They could have been a part of that. They could have been running the machines. The union would have still had control, but it was this insistence upon not wanting to give in to the demands of the major tobacco makers, cigar makers, that were basically, most of the demands were pretty standard. We want to be able to weigh tobacco. Tobacco should be weighed. No more hand roll. Of course, no more hand roll. So if you're a roller, now you're out of a job, and you don't want to work on a machine making the cigars, your thing is rolling. So you feel like you've been displaced, you're obsolete. But in reality, there were still plenty of other jobs for plenty of other individuals. So who got these jobs? Women and children. Women and children benefited most from the unions backfiring on them, the whole strike, the boycott. Women and children were the ones that gained most. One could say they gained a lot in the sense, but at the same time, the cigar makers felt that they were gaining a whole lot more. Employing women and children meant lower wages, number one. Number two, it also meant that you didn't have to give them their cigar stipend, right? And a lot of women just didn't smoke. It wasn't something women did back then, especially cigars. So you had that, and you had the children. You got to remember that the child labor laws didn't go into effect until the 1930s. I think 1938. So you had very young children working in these warehouses. Preferably, the cigar factories like to hire young girls. And of course, in the midst of all of this is the major concern of the safety and the welfare of children. And to some extent, also the safety and the welfare of the women working there that were subject to sexual harassment, or particularly if they were leaving late at night, and the streets weren't as well lit as they are nowadays. There was a concern for their safety in getting home. But despite having more sanitary conditions in these factories and warehouses, there was still a dark side to working in these warehouses because they worked them to the bone. They didn't give them many breaks, and because there was no union to protect them, there was a lot that the employer could get away with. Now that's just to start with, right? Because, the women would say, well, this allows me to take home a little something extra. So women did gain some monetary relief from these jobs, but they also paid a heavy tax, and they were at basically they were at the whim of their employer, and it didn't always fare so well for women and children within the cigar industry workforce. It was a different time. So 1919 is when basically Blackstone Cigars moved its factory to New Jersey. But looking back now a little bit to 1890, we're going to look at a little bit something different that's going on for Weight and Bond. And this is from the Tobacco Journal, Volume 6, number 1, May 10th, 1889. And it says, Weight and Bond cigar manufacturers at Blackstone Street, Boston, have been much annoyed by the posting of placards denouncing their cigars. F.C. Babson has been arrested for posting them, the specific charge being violation of city ordinance by posting bills on the property of the city. This was also reported in the newspapers the following year in 1890. Boston Evening Transcript, April 17, 1890, details trying to boycott cigar makers. And trying to boycott cigar makers was an article that I found interesting, and the writer also found interesting, because it kind of started to show the writing on the wall for what was to come. And in this article, it says, trying to boycott cigar makers, Frederick C. Babson, cigar maker, was arrested late yesterday afternoon, nominally charged with violating a city ordinance by posting bills on lampposts without permission of the mayor. In reality, for trying to put a boycott on Weight and Bond's goods. For the poster read thus: don't smoke Blackstone cigars as Weight and Bond handle non-union goods. The following is the interesting story of the cause of the boycott. 2 years ago, the Cigar Makers Union had trouble with the manufacturers of this city. Fight was made particularly against F.P. Norton and Company, who then went to New York. They got a large number of workmen together and determined to come back here. Babson asked to be sent to head off these new men. He was sent, but Mr. Norton won him over and he went to work with the other scabs. Shortly after the Knights of Labor organized an assembly of the men in the Nortons, the union-fighting Norton and Company got out stickers which called upon the public not to buy their cigars because they were scab-made. The members of the local assembly 880, wanting revenge, picked on Weight and Bond, the largest manufacturer in the city and a strict union shop, and worked this counter boycott. So you see how there was this malice in the way that they were approaching Weight and Bond, and overall, it just did not seem like this was on the up and up.